Hello and welcome. I'm Susan Swetnam, a member of Holy Spirit Parish in Pocatello. I was an English professor at ISU for about 35 years, and I'm a longtime writer with many articles and 9 books in print, 2 more in production to come in the next 2 years. Over the last decade and a half, I've been writing a lot for Catholic presses. My most recent book that came out in 2019 is about the work I've been doing in retirement as a massage therapist for elderly and dying folks. And it actually recently won a National Catholic Book Award, first place for 2020. So I'm really happy about that. This talk is closer in its approach, though, to an earlier book of mine that Loyola Press published in 2006, a series of reflections for teachers specifically, based on the lives of saints, both religious educators and classroom teachers. It's called My Best Teachers Were Saints, and it came out from Loyola Press. I've had a daily dedication to saints myself now for nearly 2 decades, ever since I discovered how helpful and inspirational and sustaining saints can be. I discovered that after my husband died young of cancer, and for a while there I almost lost myself too. The last 8 months have demonstrated that, to me at least, that the saint's example can be equally sustaining in this time of COVID, especially as it extends and we're all getting more and more exhausted. It seems at the beginning a lot of us thought, at least I thought, I can stand anything for a month or 2. But now it's been 8 months at the speaking and counting, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. The saints, for me, in this period, as in that other time of great trouble, really have been friends above, as the old hymn says. And I want to share that perception with you right now. First, by giving a very short review of who the saints are as a group, then a little quick survey of some saints who I found very helpful for various aspects of living with COVID. Then a slightly longer case study of a saint whose life is particularly relevant to the extension of trouble that we're facing now. I hope you find these observations helpful for yourself, helpful enough that you might share the stories of specific saints and the idea of general devotion to saints with your religious education students and all you guide in the faith. So first, a very brief review of who the saints are. In common speech, saints are associated with otherworldly goodness and perfection. They're seen as people most of us can't begin to be like, though we can admire them. In fact, though, they're considered as different in degree, but not in kind from us. That doesn't mean their lives were necessarily perfect all the way, that they were always tolerant and kind and had ideal behavior toward others. Many of their life stories, in fact, show that they were really quirky human beings who were sometimes impatient, too sure or unsure themselves, even momentarily disobedient or self-willed. And as an example, here's Teresa of Avila, a brilliant mystic and the first female father of the church, a writer and reformer of monasteries, but she also had a temper and a sense of humor and really serious opinions, and was not afraid to express them. So she sometimes got in wrangles with people for all of her transcendent holiness. That's a main reason why I love the saints, in fact. You can identify with their struggles, with their wishes to be better people, their distinctive personalities, and the varied flavors of their faith. If all those folks can become saints, I think sometimes there's hope for all of us. What distinguishes saints is that their lives hearingly and unconditionally responded to God's call, in the words of an authority on saints, that they led lives that led to ever-increasing union and conformity with Christ. They've been termed our friends above, as I've said, people who understand our struggles and applaud our successes in trying to be better people. They're thought to be close enough to Christ to intercede for those who call on them. And I think we'd be foolish if we didn't do that often. Saints have been celebrated since the earliest days of the church. In the very beginning, saints were designated informally and locally. They were holy people, sometimes martyrs, sometimes others who were good examples or deeply beloved and kind in the community, and much of service. Their names were recorded. That's the simplest definition of canonized, written down in a book, so others would remember them after their immediate generation faded. In the Middle Ages, things got more centralized as popes assumed more control of the church. Pope Innocent III, at the turn of the 12th century, established formal procedures for canonization. In 1634, Urban VIII declared that only the popes could designate saints. So that sort of local informality went away at that point. The procedures for how one becomes canonized, going through the stages and the proof, have been revised several times since then. Most notably, John Paul II reformed the process, and his reforms have added almost 500 new saints, many from the parts of the world underrepresented up till now, places like Africa and Asia and South America. So now we have an incredibly diverse group of fairly recently designated saints. And today's roster of saints is thus varied and very vast. A Benedictine nun I know and love says there's a saint for everybody. And I'd extend that by saying there are also saints for every stage of life, every crisis, every challenge. A heavenly host of friends above, like those in this painting, whose earthly lives will strike a particular chord in a particular situation, who offer comfort and inspiration for whatever we might be going through, including all the troubles of this time of COVID. So among all of those saints, I want today to talk about just a few of them, and I'm going to start with a sampler of saints who I think are particularly helpful in this time of COVID in particular. So the most obvious subcategory of these is, you might think of them as medical saints, saints who minister directly to victims or intercede for victims because of their own suffering from various kinds of disease or illness. I want to begin with some of them, and here are a couple of them going about their work. There are at least hundreds of saints in this category who become patrons associated with particular diseases or health services, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested and if it's relevant to you, to do some research in dictionaries of the saints indexed by particular patronage. I'll talk in a second about dictionaries or directories of saints, but some of them do have in the back a little index by, if you're thinking about this or this kind of person or doing this kind of work, here's a saint for you. And here's some examples that you may very well know. Saint Blaise is a patron for lung troubles and diseases, and so he's obviously relevant to COVID. And Saint Pantaleon is the patron of doctors working with infectious diseases. So if you know someone like that or are someone like that yourself, he would be a good saint for you to get to know if you don't already. In the interest of time, though, I'm just going to note two associated specifically with epidemics in this category of saints ministering directly to victims. In particular, both of these ministered to people during the mother of all epidemics, the Black Plague, that swept through Europe in successive waves or surges, we might call them today, during the late medieval and early modern times, into the early 18th century. Into the 1700s. And it was as you may well know, it was a terrible series of diseases and a terrible disease. And by some historians' reckonings, carried off 60% of the population of Europe in total. Some towns had no people left. So it was a really, really dreadful scourge. So I'm going to start first, naturally, with a patron of plague sufferers himself, Saint Roch, or Rocco. We don't know much about him, but he's said to have been a native of France who happened to be on pilgrimage to Italy in the 1300s when the plague broke out in Rome. Rather than fleeing, he made himself useful. He could have turned around and gone home, but he didn't. He stayed and ministered to people suffering from the plague. Mostly, he prayed over sick people, seeing, as a biographer says, in the plague-stricken an image of the Savior stricken for the sins of all. So, and in this image of St. Roch, you'll see that he's asking Mary for help directly and interceding for mercy for those who are sick. In fact, the story goes that many were cured by the power of his prayer. But eventually, like so many courageous medical professionals today, he himself caught the disease. And again, the Black Plague was transmitted by fleas, and that wasn't well known. And so it was very, very easy to catch it. He survived, though, and one thing I think that's interesting and notable is that he displayed in doing that a kind of common sense that a lot of our own contemporaries could use. What he did when he knew he was sick is that he went away and quarantined himself in a rural hut all by himself. And instead of a grocery store delivery, a dog brought him food, allegedly. And so in this particular painting, I don't think there's a dog, but in many paintings of Saint Roch, there's a wonderful big dog standing next to him, although never carrying a little basket with food in it. But that's the substance of what happened. And he recovered, thanks to his own prayers and thanks to grace and thanks to the dog. And so he's somebody to invoke in the time of plague. You can ask St. Roch to pray for you or to pray for your loved ones, for protection or for healing. And he is the time-honored saint for that. Another saint who ministered during a later outbreak was equally courageous but not so lucky. This is St. Aloysius Gonzaga, and the image is of a statue of him helping or carrying a plague victim to the hospital that stands on the campus of Gonzaga University in Spokane. He was a well-born Spaniard, again, somebody who probably could have avoided the whole problem of illness and contagion by taking himself off to an ancestral place, but he had defied his aristocratic father and become a student at a Jesuit seminary in Rome in the 1580s. And as a student, he showed immense holiness and promise. He was clearly going to be a major, major figure. But when the Black Plague broke out again in another of his surges, not long after he arrived, he dedicated himself to laboring tirelessly. The Jesuits in Rome had established a hospital specifically for the plague, and Gonzaga insisted that he serve in that hospital. He was a model of selfless charity and tireless work, and as you can see here, the story is that he personally went out into the streets and found suffering ones and carried them with his own arms to the hospital. He saved many lives, according to the records, including one of another Jesuit who became a saint, Robert Bellarmine. And he comforted those who couldn't be saved with reassurance of God's love. He became, in the brief time he operated in that capacity, really famous for doing that. Within a year, though, he unfortunately caught the disease himself and died at age 23. So Aloysius Gonzaga is another saint who it would be very good to pray for protection, for healing, for comfort, and for courage yourself if you're a medical provider in dealing with the people that you tend to. Now, most of us, of course, are not going to be called on to take the direct risks medical professionals daily encounter in these times of COVID. So what I want to do for the rest of the time I have is to focus on saints for the rest of us, people, holy men and women that we too can look to as mentors for inner strength and inspiration as we serve others in our different capacities, specifically as teachers and as community leaders. So the first group that I want to talk about is mentors for servant leadership. Mentors, saint mentors who can show us how to be inspirational and effective leaders in times like this. And those of us who are teachers and thus by definition leaders and role models can obviously, by our calm words and our example, comfort and shore up the courage of those we shepherd. They're already looking to us for knowledge and insight. Let's show them by the way we live that we also can face this sort of a danger with faith and equanimity. That doesn't mean, of course, that we should pretend that COVID, quote, isn't anything, or ignore healthcare measures like masks and social distancing in the interest of preventing a panic. What it does mean is that, as the 20th century Saint Padre Pio suggested, we start with our own inner lives, doing our best to set aside crippling fear by putting our trust in God's wisdom for us. Pray, hope, and don't worry, Padre Pio said. Worry is useless. This attitude of trust for Padre Pio wasn't just theory. He knew terrible, potentially crippling worry all his life. He was born into rural poverty at a time where general mortality and starvation and hardship were very, very common in that context. He himself caught typhoid fever at age 10. He subsequently suffered from ill health all of his life, including physical and emotional problems. He also faced distrust and negative sanctions from church authorities. As you may well know, Padre Pio was a mystic. He received the stigmata, he saw apparitions, and there were skeptics even within the church about his life and what he said was happening to him, what he testified was happening to him. Yet he lived what he preached, persisting through his life and testifying to his ongoing trust in God by cheerfully inspiring others and doing concrete good works. After World War I, when Italy was essentially in a shambles, he founded a hospital for his region's neediest. In a time marked by economic destitution and widespread despair, which should sound familiar, he was a beacon of hope to many, many people. As Padre Pio knew and acted upon, the fact is that people especially long to be reassured by their shepherds that they are known and cared for in times of crisis. We may not be able to cure whatever plague it is that haunts our students, but as leaders we can tend to their basic needs, including the need for love that witnesses our own faith as giver and strengthens their faith by our example. The Idaho Catholic Register recently profiled one of these teacher mentor saints, St. Charles Borromeo, the Bishop of Milan, during yet another 16th century plague outbreak. Borromeo kept his optimism and nerve during this difficult time. He found ingenious ways for his people to maintain their faith during the pandemic, ways that actually, although they happened hundreds of years ago, again mirror things that are happening today. He heard confessions through doors. He would go to people and listen at the doorway through the closed door. He built outdoor altars at public squares and crossroads so people could attend Mass through their windows. That's sort of like Zooming in person, I guess. He encouraged home preparation for confirmation, and he went door to door to administer the Holy Chrism. The only time he touched people was when he was giving them the chrism. The 15th century Florentine bishop, St. Antoninus, is another leader saint who took particularly good care of his flock during a pandemic. Antoninus was bishop of one of the richest and most cultured cities in Europe, but he was a man himself who lived humbly. And he addressed the poverty that seems to always come with plagues by selling property from his very wealthy diocese to feed the poor. And of course, he got some pushback on that when he was taking out the tapestries and the fine clothing and the goldware and things and selling it in the market. But he persisted, and he made enormous amounts of money to support his people. He made it a point to visit all parts of his diocese whenever plague, earthquake, or famine hit. Through his whole term as bishop, he went humbly on a mule and you'll see in this image that he's on his mule is standing by. He celebrated Mass on the road and took the time to hear people's individual troubles and to concretely address their needs. He made himself so beloved that his body actually, although it's desiccated now, is still displayed under a glass panel in one of Florence's most beautiful churches. And I've been there, and there are always people flocking there, visiting to still ask for his intercession. So this is a man whose care for his flock really has legs, as they say, down the centuries, and people still believe in his spirit of love and of caring. These days, we teacher leaders may be visiting and listening via Zoom rather from the back of a mule like Antinonius, or on foot like Charles Borromeo or Padre Pio, but the responsibility is the same. If we're to discharge our calling by spreading the good news about God's all-embracing love, we too must be love ourselves, reassuring people by our caring presence, whether virtual or in person, that they are seen, that they and their needs matter. It's really tempting to start feeling absolutely isolated in this kind of a time, and it's really up to us to say, I see you, you are known, you are loved. So being proactive in connecting is something I'd remind you is important to do. It's one thing to invite people to join a virtual meeting, but it's another to reach out individually to them with an email or a text or a phone call to your students, especially those that you know may be struggling with feelings of isolation or self-doubt. An additional possibility might be to start a blog or a Facebook group for those you shepherd, a forum where you post something at least every few days, and people can respond by sharing similar things with each other that they find, maybe inspirational quotes or a shared good news story or a hopeful prayer or meditation, a personal experience that speaks of God's love, a beautiful or touching photograph. To sustain us all in such difficult times, we need to remember that community needs to be nurtured actively every day, not just presumed or announced, if we're to be true servant leaders. Now, to cheer others on, of course, we need to keep our own heads on straight during a period where any reasonable person would be frightened or disheartened, and where the sheer, elongated, seemingly never-ending duration of this COVID crisis is wearing so many of us down, even if we face the first few months of the ordeal with hopeful energy. One feature of living in the time of COVID that seems especially hard on people is physical social isolation from others, either absolute through quarantine or relative as we obey common sense advice to limit our contact with others, even with loved ones. Loneliness and fear that others might be forgetting about us turns out to be exponential. The longer this goes on, the more ache we feel. One of my Catholic friends put the feeling well the other day. It's like we're all desert fathers and mothers living alone on top of our individual pedestals. Actually, in the context of that talk, I've started to think that's a really rich comparison. And you can see an image here that I'll talk about in a second of somebody literally living on top of a pedestal. I'd go so far as to suggest that though our lives are, of course, very different in the 21st century, those generations of Christian hermits can actually teach us a lot about how to refocus our sense of what it means to be personally isolated, and so can help us weather COVID separation anxiety much better than we would otherwise have done. The key is that word refocus, I think. In our culture, we're taught that always being sociable is essentially for happy, psychologically healthy life. Loners are mistreated and scorned as losers. People who aren't invited to a party or a gathering every weekend start to wonder if they're pathetic and not very likable. Though as Catholics, we might say, we admire those centuries of saints who withdrew from ordinary life to solitary contemplation. Since we're almost can't help but be infused with that mindset, we probably think of those hermits as very weird and couldn't imagine imitating their lives. But if you study their lives more closely, you'll see that they were onto something profound and anything but losers. They embraced isolation deliberately, in fact, for deeply spiritual purposes. Living in the noisy social world, they were convinced, distracted them from what really mattered. In the silence they embraced, they could focus on prayer and relationship with God. They could cultivate essential self-discipline and humility. In solitude and silence, they could hear God speak and devote their lives to contemplating Him. Still, even though they were on retreat with God in such a profound way, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily cut off from serving other people too. The image you're looking at here shows one of the most extreme of these saints, kind of a famous one, whose name was Simeon Stylites. He lived on top of a pillar in 3rd century Syria, and literally on top of a pillar. He looks pretty lonely here and maybe a little discontented. But besides spending his days in contemplation and prayer all by himself, he actually lectured to and individually counseled people who came to him as pilgrims and actually wrote letters to other people. Many, many, many people made the trek out to the desert to see Simeon and other pillar-sitting saints. They were really quite the draw for pilgrims. So many people sought his counsel, in fact, that he had a little bit of a problem. He was counting on being out there and resting in God, but people kept coming and coming and coming. And the first thing he did to try to protect his privacy was to make his pillar higher. In the beginning, it was only 10 feet, and it progressed in stages, and by the time he finished, it was supposedly at 50 feet. So he kept removing himself higher and higher. Even that didn't help. And people kept coming and coming until there was none of the peace that he was seeking. And so he eventually had his patrons build a wall around the pillar to, I guess you could say, socially distance people out in the desert beyond the reach of him. But he was definitely somebody who influenced other people. The Desert Hermit movement had many, many converts. Actually, history suggests that that's where monasticism in general began, as groups of hermits started to live together and worship together. But many of them actually did stay alone and as isolated as they could be, praying and living ascetic lives of complete devotion. And what an amazing model they were for their contemporaries. Now, a little bit later in history, medieval women who were called anchoresses, like St. Julian of Norwich, who's shown here, did something similar. Seeking wholly to serve God, they had themselves literally walled up in small cells attached to churches. And if you go especially to England these days and know where to look, you can still see these tiny little stone appendages to churches where an anchoress would have lived. They spent their time praying, reading, and living again a life of asceticism and focus. But they also had interactions with other people. They had 3 windows typically built into their cells, not doors, they couldn't go out, but they had windows built into their cells. One looked outside, onto the outside world. Another looked into an interior chamber where servants brought food and removed waste. So they weren't just piling, they weren't not eating or anything. They were being fed, but it was handed in through a window. The third, as in this painting, opens into the church proper so they could go to Mass and take the Eucharist, and other people could be reminded of their presence, so the presence of these holy people. Through the outside window, many of them counseled others who came seeking spiritual direction. Julian herself actually did that for Marjorie Kemp, another famous holy woman of the period, who came asking about her own spiritual life. They also served others by writing spiritual works, if they were literate, that were widely shared, and again, Julian of Norwich certainly did this. And some of them, again including Julian, pursued crafts inside their cells while they prayed. She made lace, according to legend, while she was in there, which provided income for charities. And if you are a fiber arts person yourself, as I am, you know it's perfectly possible to knit and pray at the same time. So I'm sure Julian was knitting was praying while she made lace. Their contemporaries actually understood them as not just cultivating their own souls, but also benefiting others in God's holy church by the lives they were living. On the one hand, they were exemplars. They were people who others could aspire to be like or admire, or knowing they were in the church made the church feel holier somehow. But they also saw their lives as the anchoresses themselves saw their lives as benefiting other people besides benefiting themselves. This was not just a solipsistic kind of an exercise. And we know this in part because of an instruction manual for anchoresses that exists to this day. The writer of it makes a big deal admitting that the word anchoress comes from, or anchorite for men, there were men doing this too, comes from the Greek word for withdraw. That's the formal beginning of this word. But the author doesn't let that stop him from spinning an extended metaphor on the word anchoress. He spends a lot of time instructing anchoresses to be, or aspiring anchoresses or practicing anchoresses, by comparing them to ship's anchors. Just like a literal piece of iron, he assures them, their sacrifice is keeping the church steady. They're not facing headwinds. The church is not facing a literal storm, but it's definitely, he says, facing the devil's blasts. And their very presence is keeping it on the track it's supposed to go on. So there's a sense of altruism in this, rather than just self-indulgent walling oneself up. Still, I'm betting that none of you could imagine going as far as they did, and I certainly can't either. But I do want to offer, as I suggested a little while ago, that we might just benefit during this pandemic by borrowing at least some of these hermits' mindsets and focusing on the potential and the gifts that are hidden in the way we must live now, as they saw the gifts in the way that they had decided to live. Specifically, you might decide to mentally reframe the enforced time you and your family spend alone. You spend alone in the interest of safety as a calling to grow closer to God. So if you have to be in your house more of the time than you'd like to be, why not see that as a holy opportunity rather than something to be lamented and protested about? People spend a lot of money to go on retreats, after all, and here's a tailor-made opportunity to do it for free. Have you or your family members always been too busy to pray the rosary or some other prayer, or to follow the daily readings in all of those devotionals that are so easily available? Is there a spiritual book you've always meant to read? Is there a part of Scripture you don't know very well? I actually used part of this current COVID time in conjunction with a devotional I'm writing for Liturgical Press now to get to know Acts, which I realized once I started, this is an Easter devotional, and once I started I realized that I really didn't know very much about Acts. So really, March and April were the months of Acts for me, and it turns out to have been a really sacred time. And I suggest that might be something that you could do with all of that extra time in silence that you might have. How about starting to keep a daily spiritual journal based on the day's readings? Devotional writers aren't the only ones who have something to say about those wise words. Why not make your own comments? Why not keep track of your own inspirations? How about even beginning your own spiritual autobiography? It doesn't have to be for publication. It doesn't have to even be for anybody else to read, although your family might want to. You'll learn a lot, I can guarantee, about yourself and your faith by doing such a thing. Or specifically in the spirit of this talk, how about dedicating yourself to meeting and praying with a new saint every day, including hermit saints? There's so many of just the latter category, after all, from ancient upright desert fathers and desert mothers, too. Some of them were even reformed prostitutes, like Pelagia the Penitent, who's a really interesting character. Through medieval anchoresses and anchorites, to contemplative monastics, to more modern saints who discovered deep vocation in enforced or voluntary separation from the world. Go no further than some of them who were in concentration camps in World War II, like Maximilian Kolbe. A Google search or a look at a good dictionary of the saints would certainly be a great way to start. You can Google many websites, but I'd suggest for a standing reference that an actual book would be a good choice. There are compact, easy to use alphabetical ones, like for instance the Penguin Dictionary of the Saints, which has just simply saints in alphabetical order by their first names, and with little biographical sketches, notes on the feast day, suggestions for further reading when you find somebody that you're really interested in or fascinated with. Or you can go classical, as I decided to do back as a new widow, with Alban Butler's multiple volume series, Lives of the Saints. And that's a little bit more, in a way I find it easier to use because there are 4 big volumes, but they're arranged through the year, day by day, with saints in the order of their feast days. And I've always found it very interesting in the mornings with my coffee to read who are today's saints. And it doesn't take very long, whose saints have been celebrated today. It doesn't take very long to do that in the morning, and I know I've discovered all kinds of friends above by doing that I would never have known existed. And once you find them, it's relatively easy to do more research, again, either online or in specific books or articles about the saints. I have to tell you that it may seem kind of dry to be reading about saints every morning, but I found it really addictive. And as a teacher, as I say, and my best teachers were saints, more than once I've read about a saint in the morning and then walked into a classroom and something has happened for which the saint is a really useful object of meditation. That sometimes as if that saint came to you that day rather than you seeking out that saint, because it was a day that you needed them. So for the rest of us, there are plenty of saints to buoy our enthusiasm, to give us advice, to help us be the sort of strong and altruistic and caring and real people that our students need at this point in the pandemic. And I think that would be something I'd highly recommend to you. For the rest of this talk, I'd like to cover another saint for the rest of us in a little bit more detail. For those of us who can't really serve God during this pandemic by treating other people medically or going into hospitals or anything like that, who are trying to keep ourselves together and serve His people in the world. I'd like to talk about my own patrons. She's my own patron saint, Elizabeth Ann Seton. As you may know, Seton was the first American to be canonized, male or female, and she offers what I think is a particularly good idea of how one of these holy ones can sustain us in difficult times. Though Seton might have lived in the 18th century, she faced many of the same kind of challenges we do in this time of COVID, and not only handled them admirably, but allowed God to use difficulties to lead her to service she'd never have imagined in her youth, had the difficulties not come. If you'd like to know her better, there's a wonderful newish biography of Seton by a woman named Catherine O'Donnell, and you will have the information on that on the screen. But I'll just give you a brief biographical outline here from the wealth of detail that O'Donnell and many other biographers have assembled, so you can get a sense of her life before I talk about the significance she has for the rest of us during COVID. Seton was born to wealthy parents in New York City in 1774, just 2 years before the American Revolution. She was very serious and devout as a young woman, and at 19 she married very happily and bore 5 children. In her mid-20s, she seemed to be living a perfect, happy, conventional life as a wealthy young married woman and mother in New York City, doing many works of charity, going to church regularly, but also having a rich, loving, happy social life. Just like today, though, the late 18th century was a time of economic instability and infectious disease. Business failure for her husband came in 1798, and he then grew seriously ill with that period's epidemic, tuberculosis. Seton and her husband traveled to Italy in search of a warmer climate, which was said to possibly bring relief, but he died almost as soon as they arrived. And she had one of her children with her. So here she is in a country where she doesn't speak the language, a brand new widow with a child, not knowing what to do or where to turn. Elizabeth was taken in and comforted by a family of her husband's business associates, and their Catholic faith struck such a chord of truth with her that she determined to convert from the Protestantism in which she'd been raised. That was great in Italy, but when she got back to New York City, her family and friends were absolutely, terribly upset with her. This was a time of great anti-Catholic prejudice in the United States. Catholicism was for poor, suspect immigrants, not for well-off young society women. Poor, deluded Mrs. Seton, they called her. They pitied her. They spoke about superstition and popery, the term of the time, and tried to dissuade her. Nevertheless, she stuck to her guns and converted. And before long, the Bishop of Baltimore invited her to come to that city and teach girls. New York was not a comfortable place for her in the situation. So she went. She was also left very poor, and this gave her a chance of sustenance. It gave her something good to do. She was so successful that she was, before long, directed to gather other devout women who had already started coming to her for guidance and comfort and inspiration, and establish a boarding school for Catholic girls in Western Maryland, the first of its kind in the United States. Soon she organized her teachers into a formally recognized religious order, the American Sisters of Charity, who went on to open Catholic schools all across the land in the centuries to follow. In other words, she said yes to the opportunities God put in her way, turning personal tragedy into service, adapting to what was, rather than sinking into self-pity and hopeless yearning for the way things might have been or once were. She wasn't just a survivor. She took her new way of life as a calling, as a vocation, and embraced it. Difficulties kept coming, though. Embracing vocation, as I'm sure you know, doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be smooth and happy from then on, and demands that she keep evolving. Many of them were administrative and financial. Church hierarchy wanted to control her school more than she thought was appropriate. At one point, a man who didn't really know them was demanding to be allowed to write the rule for the American Sisters of Charity rather than the Sisters of Charity themselves. And the school went through hard times in the booms and busts of that era. There were also lots and lots of epidemics, and that's where I'm coming back into the whole question of enduring through COVID. This was not just one set of epidemics, but ongoing surges, year after year, season after season. Over the years at Mount St. Mary's College, which she established, and is still there today, by the way, it's a lovely place, in Emmitsburg, Maryland, she lost many students to tuberculosis. She also lost 2 of her daughters who had stayed on as teachers and joined the American Sisters of Charity. Her sister-in-law, who also joined, also died of tuberculosis, and many of her friends in the order. It was death after death after death over a long, long period for Seton, even as she was trying to persist in the education of girls and the religious education of girls, in which she deeply believed. Nevertheless, she persisted, touching many, many, many lives with her deep faith and encouragement. Still, and I mentioned about different in kind, but not in degree, but not in kind. If you read her personal writings and her letters to others, you see that this saint also was subject to very human discouragement and weariness. She may have been utterly noble on the outside, but on the inside, sometimes she was hurting and even considered herself to be weak. One that really touches me is a letter to a friend where she wrote, after one of her second daughter's death by tuberculosis, "Here I go, like iron or rock, day after day, as God pleases and how he pleases. But to be sure, when my time comes, I shall be very glad." That's one reason why she's my patron, because I felt like that a lot in the early years of my widowhood. And I imagine some of you have too, saying yes, but also just being tired of the whole thing. And that's, I think, very relevant to the way many of us are feeling right now. I actually love knowing that about her, because knowing she felt such natural emotions makes her a more approachable model for me. The hagiographic Seton, the woman who was always strong, always devout, always sailed right through the troubles of life, is somebody I'll never be, and very few of us will ever be. On the outside, she was strong for others. She famously cheered and inspired her nuns and students through continued difficulties. But on the inside, even this saint was human sometimes, subject to the effects of extended difficulties, the kind that wear a person down exponentially the longer they go on. Still, she taught herself to say, "Let it be done to me." I think Seton's life is a very Annunciation-centered kind of a life, saying, "I will do it." She trusted that though God's ways could seem mysterious, even hard or strange indeed, they were ultimately working toward a larger transcendent purpose, one in which she was somehow enlisted and led to a path that she had to tread. Seton's example of endurance, I believe, offers essential sustenance for us as COVID enters its 9th month. At least it has for me. I've often thought of her as the daylight grows shorter, reminding myself that as a servant of God, I don't necessarily have to love what's asked of me. I just have to do it, opening my hands as Seton did to the new, even unlikely possibilities that arise, instead of lamenting the old normal or hanging back as if that could change things. I'm allowed to be sad and discouraged and tired. I'm allowed even to be angry. But if I'm going to live through this as a person of faith, and perhaps even grow in that respect, I'm required to stay in regular contact with God, to trust that through his ways, though they may seem mysterious indeed sometimes, his love is everlasting, and that he's calling me to continued service that's waiting even in these most difficult moments. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest that what's essential for you too is that you find a way to make new meaning in your life in this difficult time of COVID, that you think of it as an opportunity rather than just a trial. You might choose to selflessly tend others as those healing saints did, to encourage others by words, deeds, and examples as the servant leader saints did. You might choose to reframe enforced solitude in your mind into holy time, as those hermits did. Learning to say yes to calls that whisper to you, even in the most apparently unpropitious events, as SETON did. Dedicate yourself to making this troubled season an opportunity for a deeper personal relationship with God. Granted, doing that might seem awfully daunting, and it certainly does to me, even as I try to do it myself. But as I've suggested, a wonderful and easy place to begin is to investigate the saints and identify some whose lives speak to your soul, as Elizabeth Seton speaks to mine. Find your particular friend above, take him or her as an inspirational model, cultivate a relationship through contemplation and prayers for intercession and sustenance, for learning more about that person. Because these months as COVID extends are not a time to be existentially and spiritually alone, even if you might be physically more isolated. Fortunately, as Catholics, we believe that thousands of potential companions for the journey are just waiting for us to reach to them. All we have to do is stretch out our hands.